I forgot to start that. Um, okay, sorry to go back to where I was here. The history of NABAT is more involved than what I'm about to give, but here's just some background to give you context. The Bat Grid 1.0 was an interagency bat monitoring effort in Oregon and Washington, and it operated from 2003 to 2010. And NABAT evolved from this program and the National White Nose Syndrome response and launched in 2015 as a collaborative long-term monitoring program designed to assess status and trends of North American bats. And I think it's important to reiterate the aims of NABAT since they are the foundation of how the creation of the hub idea came about. So NABAT aims to increase quantity and quality of available data on North American bat species, make data accessible for addressing bat conservation problems and management needs, and use these data to provide regular updates on species status and trends. For which they did in 2022. I mentioned this at last year's meeting, but NABAT published a status and trends report in 2022. And in this report, they used summer population monitoring data from the NABAT database as a line of evidence to better understand the status and trends of 12 North American bat species. Specifically, they used occupancy analysis to produce occupancy probability distribution maps and related metrics based on modeled habitat relationship. Notably, they found that little brown bats, northern long-eared bats, and tricolored bats have experienced marked declines in range-wide average occupancy probabilities. And this was over a 9-year survey period with severity varying by species and region, little browns occurring in our region. So in this report, they broke occupancy out by state, and here's just a quick little snapshot of some of the negative trends exhibited for little browns, little brown occupancy in Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. And this is significant, especially in light of the fact that little brown bats are candidate species being considered for federal listing. And so how does participating in NABAT lead to accomplishing the objectives that I mentioned a couple slides ago? By leaning on some key pillars. So having a protocol that's consistent, but also flexible, having a probabilistic sampling approach with a unifying sampling design, and having multiple survey types for a weight of evidence in integrated data analysis. And having these tools enables sampling across the entire continent, accounting for imperfect detections, and it also helps fill local and range-wide information needs for effectively managing bat populations. And so NABAT uses a number of survey methods to facilitate bat monitoring across North America. Those methods are internal colony counts, external colony counts, acoustic surveys using stationary detectors and mobile transects, and capture records. And by looking at multiple status variables informed by multiple data streams, we can see a more complete picture of where North American bats occur, in what kinds of numbers, and how these metrics change over time. So NABAT is a lot of things. It's a network of people participating in bat monitoring of many types across North America. It's protocols and guidance that facilitate standard data collection procedures that make data comparable across space and time. It's also a sample design that optimizes individual efforts to meet information needs at multiple scales. It's also a database, or a very large data repository, where data across multiple data types can be aggregated into one common location. And they are analytical support and products like that status and trends analysis. And engaging with any of these things makes you an NABAT partner. And so I'm going to hone in here on the network a little bit more. Many NABAT partners have formed regional collaboratives that are referred to as hubs. And these hubs are dotted throughout North America. They span across the lower 48 and up to Alaska and Canada as well. And hubs serve as nodes in the network to implement NABAT regionally and locally. And hubs also unite regional partners like you all to leverage and share resources and expertise, which creates an economy of scale that addresses our individual and shared challenges and fills information needs. And so in comes the Northwest Bat Hub. The Northwest Regional Bat Hub was developed in 2016 to provide training and also support to strengthen collaboration and increase engagement with the North American Bat Monitoring Program model in the Pacific Northwest. And the Northwest Bat Hub is housed within the HERS Lab, or Human Ecosystem Resilience and Sustainability Lab, here at Oregon State University Cascades, which is located in Bend, Oregon. And here's just a quick intro of the Northwest Bat Hub team to put some faces to the roles. We've got Diana Pop, who serves as a GIS specialist, support specialist for us, myself as the coordinator. Some of you may remember Patrick Embledge. He was our data manager who has moved on to another really cool opportunity. So we've been currently hiring for and preparing to welcome in a new data manager and data scientist for the lab. Nadia Schmidt, who is a bat biologist with us and is our call analyst as well. So she's the one who is mining through all of that call data that gets sent our way. Sarah Rose, who wears many hats for us. She's the Audible Bats Project Manager, serves as an assistant coordinator. She's also a grad student and will be presenting later on her Audible Bats work. And then last but not least, we have our HERS Lab co-directors, Matt Schinderman, who's with OSU Cascades, and then Tom Rodhouse, who's with the National Park Service. And then we are also comprised of our local and regional partners, like all of you, who conduct bat monitoring in the tri-state area in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And we have a number of collaborative partnerships with you all to collect this long-term monitoring data for bats in the Pacific Northwest region. And I mentioned that there are different hubs across North America, and we all offer a varying levels of support to our regional partners. So they're all working for the same goals, but are maybe just structured a little bit differently in what we can each offer. And I'll just touch on some of the services that the Northwest Bat Hub does provide. The hub coordinates the regional NABAT surveys across partners in the Pacific Northwest. We provide data management, QA/QC, and we upload all call data to the NABAT partner portal. We also offer equipment sharing, storage, and management, acoustic call processing, and manual vetting. And annually, we provide an updated regional protocol for NABAT monitoring. We also provide agency trainings and a regional Pacific Northwest report. We also provide field support by hiring on 6 seasonal staff who conduct surveys in the tri-state area to help offset the agency field efforts and cover a broader range. And we also offer regional and local support for projects beyond NABAT, summer occupancy acoustics, such as our year-round monitoring, projects and Audible Bats Project, which attempts to fill data gaps for spotted and pallid bats in the region. Again, that Sarah will talk more about later. So this is our dashboard, which tracks all NA-BAT data collected in the tri-state area. And this map figure shows acoustic sites surveyed in 2023. And as you can see, 432 individual acoustic sites were surveyed in Oregon, 333 in Washington, and 199 sites in Idaho, for a grand total of 964 individual acoustic sites surveyed across 313 sample units. And so in this map, cells that contain those orange dots are sample units that were surveyed. And you can see there's really great even spatial distribution of surveys across the region. And this just gives you a nice overall visual for just how widespread the surveys are here in our region. They're also consistent. If you look back on the last few years of data, that we've been consistently surveying the same sample units for a number of years now. Excuse me. So here are just a few totals by agency participation, which of course is quite variable based on the number of priority sample units that are located in your areas of jurisdiction and the size of those areas. But you can see here how OSU and the Northwest Bat Hub bringing on seasonal crews really helps to reach more, well, private lands in particular, but also offset URL's participation in the program, and having the additional field crews accounts for nearly a third of the sample units that are surveyed in the region. So thank you for continuing to support that, support our field crews. And the Northwest Bat Hub manages and uploads data in the NA Bat portal, which gets distributed to 4 main projects. If you're familiar with the partner portal, you probably have access to one of these projects. And those projects are Northwest NA Bat, which is a big chunk of the region's call data. NA Bat Idaho, which Rita Dixon with IDFG manages. There's also the Pacific Region 1 National Wildlife Refuges project, and then Forest Service Region 4, which includes some data that's collected outside of our region. So that one is maintained separately. And these are the total records from 2023 data. So you can see just the sheer volume of data that comes our way is well over 1 million files. And after being scrubbed of noise, etc., the total's still above 500,000 processed call files. So Nadia spends a lot of time looking at all of this data. And now just a quick little takeaway note on call data. Since again, maybe some of you who are attending this are also placing detectors in the field, it's important to really critically think through your microphone placement when you are deploying detectors. And I'll get into this way more in depth at our annual training, which will happen likely the first week of June. But it's just important to understand the difference between high quality and low quality detector placement and how that can really impact call data. So you can see from this top shot is a sort of blurred out series of call pulses that make it impossible to make a definitive species ID on. And there is a poor noise to signal ratio, which is caused by the mic being placed too close to clutter. And any sources of clutter around the microphone will cause this type of unwanted distortion or echoes. And as a result, confident call ID is often impossible. And to be fair, placing your microphones in cluttered habitats can be challenging. But when in doubt, just direct the microphone towards the most open space in a tight corridor, or clear out obstructions from the microphone. And then this is also an example of a high quality call. The second picture is a best case scenario. Proper mic placement, and it's set away from the clutter along the forest edge. And again, I'm not going to go into this anymore, but it's just a big takeaway in light of knowing just how much call data comes our way. It's also really important to be collecting as high quality of data as possible in the field. So the Bat Hub continues to analyze data from 4 year-round monitoring index sites with the Forest Service. So we have the Siuslaw, who just set up a new station this past year. The Deschutes, Olympic, and Okanagan Wenatchee. And right now we're able to assess activity changes for different species on the landscape at these station locations. And there are year-round monitoring stations dotted throughout our Pacific Northwest region, and partners such as WDFW and the USGS and Fish and Wildlife Service are interested in exploring a greater understanding of what our collective regional year-round monitoring stations might be telling us, and how a future analysis of our collective year-round monitoring data can help with management decisions. And so I shared this last year, but it remains relevant as a publication was released about these singing silver-haired bats. The Coos Bay BLM year-round monitoring site recorded some unique silver-haired social calls that match unusual recordings that some other biologists had documented. And they've now been identified as songs, so singing silver-haired bats. This was something that was new to science and was published late last year in a Wildlife Society bulletin. And Nadia received some acknowledgement in this publication for the silver-haired songs that she vetted and submitted for their project. Just kind of a neat thing that we were able to pick up some of these calls. Another project that's ongoing for us is Modus Tower, which was last year we had received a donation from a donor who wanted to have a Modus Tower erected here in Bend, and that was placed on the OSU campus. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Modus, it's a wildlife tracking system that uses automated radio telemetry to track movements of flying animals over great distances. And so we continue to make adjustments to our tower and monitor its detectability. Nadia did a lot of legwork to get this up and running and continues to stay really connected with the Pacific Northwest Modus Network, and participate in that. And Ted Weller gave a great talk at the Pac West Hub meeting last week that just demonstrated the higher detection rates of tagged bats in areas where there's a greater density of towers, which of course totally makes sense and seems obvious, but we're excited to further participate in Modus projects as partners work to expand the network and create a denser network of Modus towers here in the Northwest. So another resource that the hub provides is a data viewer, which is typically linked with our website, although a couple of updates are being made right now. But Diana put a lot of work into upgrading our data viewer and transferring it over to the Experience Builder platform. So eventually this will be linked on the website, but I just put together a little video walkthrough. So you can click into the map, which allows you to explore, species richness by sample unit in the region. And this is a cumulative occurrence from 2016 through 2023. You can also click through some of the different gap ranges for bat species in the region. You can filter by state or county, or by land management agency. So if you're with the Forest Service, you can filter by your national forest and zoom in and see which sample units are contained within your jurisdictional lands, and click in to see what the bat occurrences. And also, I think maybe it was blocked at the bottom there. You can click in to just 2023 sample units that were surveyed, and you can, let's say you want to see where big brown bats were found in the region in 2023, you can filter by bat species. And then also our website is currently linked here. So anyway, this is a work in progress, but we're open to hearing from you all on what you might like to see in our data viewer, any other layers that you would like to see added, and certainly want feedback on the functionality and user friendliness of the platform. I think it will be much more user friendly here in Experience Builder than the previous platform. So another product and resource that the Northwest Bat Hub and National Park Service collaborated on was recently published, is the National Park Service Protocol Implementation Plan. And this implementation plan outlines how the regional NA Bat protocol will be implemented by the Northwest Bat Hub and National Park staff within 3 National Park Service networks in the Pacific Northwest region. So the Klamath Network, the Upper Columbia Basin Network, and the North Coast and Cascades Network. And the protocol implementation plan details the annual cycle of activities that the National Park Service and the Hub will collaboratively undertake to ensure that the National Park Service is reaching its vital signs monitoring goals for bats across its parks in the region. Fish and Wildlife Service is also working on a similar document, as they kind of share a similar inventory and monitoring culture. And this was just released, I think, within the last couple weeks, but USGS staff, along with our very own Tom Rodhouse, have released a code vignette for application of a Bayesian single season occupancy model for assessing silver-haired bat occurrence in Oregon and Washington. So I won't get too far into that, but the Northwest Bat Hub, continues to shepherd our data set to allow for the creation of products like this code vignette. And this is a great example of how our collaborative, long-term, consistent data set can lead to reproducible products that benefit all of us and importantly, benefit bats in the region. So Northwest Bat Hub has had a very busy year conducting a lot of outreach events and volunteering with partners. Just to go over a couple of them, we assist with white nose syndrome sampling at caves here in Central Oregon with ODFW and the Forest Service. A number of us were also had media interviews, Oregon Public Broadcasting, Think Out Loud had a radio interview with me on bats in Oregon. Nadia and myself were interviewed on the Northwest Nature Matters podcast about NABAT and the hub. Sarah was interviewed on local TV for her Audible Bats project, and she also presented a poster for the Western Bat Working Group meeting last April on Audible Bats. And then Patrick, our former data manager, helped with a 2-day NABAT data management workshop where he was a panelist and a presenter. Sarah conducts Audible Bat volunteer outings during each month of the summer. We also assist partners with monitoring projects, including the WDFW, probiotic sites, and National Park Service with trapping efforts in Mount Rainier. Nadia assisted ODFW with bat sampling efforts for the Klamath Dam removal project here in Oregon. And also Tom Rodhouse was the keynote speaker for the OSU Cascades Discovery Day on how bats inspired radical conservation collaborations. And I also was able to participate and present for a number of meetings and workshops over the last year. So at the Pacific Northwest Native American Workshop on Bats, on NABAT and the Hub. And then also for an American Fish and Wildlife Association State Wildlife Action Plan Learning Series, which I know some of you were in that learning series, but I was able to present on NABAT and the Hub and how incorporating bat monitoring into State Wildlife Action Plan updates and how including NABAT and collaboration with hubs is serves as an example of an existing program and partnership that states can tap into in order to help address bat data needs. And so to kind of wrap things up here, a couple of upcoming things and ways to plug in with us in the near future, and to look out for our annual training, where we'll take a deep dive into detector sighting, operation and placement, as well as like walk through critical, excuse me, critical firmware updates, and that sort of thing. Important to make sure your detectors are operational. We'll also distribute out an updated protocol and be on the lookout for opportunities to plug into our Audible Bats project, which Sarah will talk a little bit about more later. But otherwise, I think that is going to wrap it up for me. Thanks so much for listening, and let's see. Is it still sharing? Okay. Sorry. Have minor difficulties today.
Stop share is up in Teams, not in.
Yes. Yeah, I see it here.
Okay. Your mouse.
Anyway, I think we have maybe a minute or two for some questions if anyone had anything now. And if not, feel free to reach out to me later after the meeting. And if not, then maybe we'll go ahead and have Trent present on some of the work that he's been doing for us over the last few months.
Yeah, let me go ahead and share my screen here. Can everybody see that? Let me go into presentation mode here. Okay, are we good there?
Looks good, yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, hi everybody. Yeah, thanks for that first presentation, Beth. It's great to hear about, everything that you guys have had going on, even though I've been a little bit in the loop lately. So just briefly how I got kind of wrapped into this project. I used to work at the Bat Hub from about 2017 to 2019, 2020-ish. And I was between my master's and PhD in statistics and reached out to Tom just looking to kind of get my hands dirty with some ecological applications of statistics. And he said that, they had been wanting to make some updated distribution maps for all of the species in the Pacific Northwest. For a little while, I know that Beth, you highlighted some of the work that's been done by NABAT Central, which is really great and covers a few key species, but left out quite a few of our species in the Pacific Northwest here. Just a quick disclaimer, it has been a little while since I've been in the bat world, so I apologize if I use any incorrect terminology or names or anything like that. But anyways, with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Maybe. Yeah, there we go. So I'll start by kind of giving an overview of the Maxent machine learning method. Maybe some of you have heard it before. It's become really popular, especially over the last maybe 5 to 10 years. After that, I'll talk about, the data that we use to feed into the model. We'll look at results, which is like the pretty maps part. That'll be exciting. And then I'll talk about like a brief application or how we might be able to use these maps and results. So just to motivate the talk a little bit, I think Tom probably shows this figure at every meeting, or at least he did at the last one that I attended in 2019, I think. And just want to remind everybody that when we kind of do these regional modeling exercises, we're down here at the base of our information pyramid, I guess. Just looking at, broad regional trends, rather than, looking really specifically into one area or maybe some of these other things that are going on with demography or white nose, things like that. And Maxent is definitely especially equipped to work at that level. So I'll start with just talking about, why we might build a model. So there's kind of two reasons. The first is, we might want to understand the relationship between two or more things. That's kind of a more traditional statistical framework. And the second is that we might want to make predictions about something across time or space, which is obviously super well represented by this person thinking or something. And you can almost kind of imagine these on like a spectrum where one side is we really care about just understanding what the true relationship is between, let's say, bad occurrences and temperature. And the other side is we really only care about making good predictions across the landscape. And so if those two things are on a spectrum, you can imagine that Maxent is kind of leading more towards those predictions. Same thing with like a lot of the stuff that's been coming out lately with AI, like ChatGPT and stuff like that. Like that would be like an extreme example, but just getting to the idea that we almost don't even know what goes on in the middle. We just know the product. So I'd say Maxent is leaning towards that side, but not quite that far. And the reason I say that is because Maxent leverages this thing in data science and statistics that we talk about a lot called the bias variance trade-off. And so what that is that if you look over here on the left, you can see that these blue points are represented by data that we feed our model, and then the red line is the model. So if we have super high variance in our predictions, this is what's called overfitting. Basically, our model won't generalize well when we show it new data. On the other side of the spectrum, we have underfitting, which is represented by high bias. So if our weights are or our parameters that we're estimating are biased maybe towards 0 or towards a larger number, we predict the same thing all the time for every species. And the idea is you want to strike a good balance between these two things. What Maxent does is it's a form of something we call penalized regression. It says, okay, we're going to accept a little bit higher bias towards 0 in order to have a little bit lower variance in our predictions. So that's what makes it really good for making predictions across space. So the way Maxent kind of works is that we show it presence points or species occurrences that you all have been working very hard to collect. And then we feed it background points or random points across the landscape. In this case, that would be Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And then we also give it environmental predictors in the form of rasters. And then for each pixel of that raster, it makes a prediction about, it says kind of what is the availability of habitat in that pixel versus what is the availability of habitat across all of the landscape. So what's happening where we have presence points, and then what's happening just generally across the landscape. It takes a ratio of those two things, and the output is what we call relative abundance, or what is the relative abundance of suitable habitat within that little pixel. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. After that, it does something called a logistic transformation, which is a really common thing to do in data science, which gives us a number that's bound between 0 and 1. And we can interpret that as a probability of occurrence, which is a lot nicer than just some random number that represents relative abundance. The reason that Maxent has become really popular for this exercise is because it allows us to consider really complex models. And what I mean by complex models is a lot of times in traditional statistical models, we might only be looking at what we call linear functions, where we expect that the relationship between maybe a species occurrence probability and, let's say, temperature is a straight line, and we want to estimate the slope of that line. But maybe that's not what the real relationship looks like. Maybe it's a curvy line, like one of these nonlinear functions, or maybe it's a piecewise function, or just something more complicated. But adding these into our models can make them really difficult to interpret. So the benefits of Maxent are that we can consider these kinds of complex models and get really good predictions and strong generalization across the landscape. But the downside is that we kind of lose interpretability of our model. We're not actually looking at, trying to figure out what the exact relationship is between all of our covariates. We're more focused on the predictions. And then finally, this method really differs from a lot of the methodology that's been used by the Bat Hub and with a lot of the different Bayesian models and things they've used by kind of completely ignoring spatiotemporal correlation. And what I mean by that is that we're basically taking all of our occurrences and saying, we're pretending that these kind of all happened at the same time, which, Tom and our other folks at the USGS do a lot of work to basically be able to make inferences about what's happening across space and time. This time we're just looking at distribution across the landscape. All right, so moving on, I'll get into what data we fed into this model, starting with the environmental covariates we used. I'll say that I came up with these environmental covariates by conducting a literature review of what's already been done by NABAT Central and what's already been done by the Bat Hub in the past in research papers. So these aren't like just random environmental covariates. They're things that have been published before. Starting with maybe the most obvious ones, temperature and precipitation. These come from the WorldClim data source, which are global rasters, I guess you could say, at the 30 arc second or about 1 kilometer squared resolution. So you can imagine a 1 kilometer square that's not really tied to the bat grid in any way. They come in like monthly rasters. So there's 12 of them from 1970 to 2000. I averaged these just to get annual temperature and precipitation, just to get kind of general landscape trends. And that's what you see over here on the right. And it's important to remember, so these are, I guess you could call them our coarsest rasters that we are using in this model. And that'll be important because for the other ones, like elevation here, it's at a 30 meter squared resolution, which is great. It's at a smaller resolution, but we need to aggregate it up to the level of the temperature and precipitation so that you could imagine we could like stack all these rasters on top of each other and say, okay, within 1 pixel, we know all of these different environmental covariates. So we have elevation at the 30 meter squared resolution. I use the National Land Cover data set that probably some of you have used before. For each pixel of this data set, also at the 30 meter squared resolution, it's left off there, but that's okay. Each pixel represents basically the majority land cover within that little area. And to kind of aggregate that up to the same resolution as our world clam rasters, I said, okay, what is the proportion of these pixels within that 1 kilometer squared area that are that specific land cover type? So forest cover, water cover, and wetland cover are specifically the ones that I included. And then finally, we have cliff and canyon cover from the Landfire data set, specifically the Landfire existing vegetation. If you've used Landfire before, they have kind of a lot of different data sets available in there. So if you wanted to recreate this, that's the one you would use. And then I took the same approach as I took for the National Land Cover data set to aggregate it up to that level, which is a similar method to what's used in a lot of the statistical analyses that we do with NABAT data, just at a smaller scale. All right, so next we get to the species occurrence records, which all came from our Northwest Bat Hub databases. And I'll start by kind of defining what I considered to be a species occurrence. So first I said any species with greater than 0 vetted calls in one recording night is an occurrence within that night. And then I said within 1 year, I didn't care really how many nights it occurred at a specific site. If it occurred once, then it occurred at that site. And then kind of step 3, and this is kind of an automatic behavior of Maxent, is that it removes all duplicate occurrences. So basically, if you had like two sites within the same little pixel, it would just randomly pick one of them because they're literally the same data point in the eyes of Maxent. It's like saying that we have an occurrence within this cell and it has all the same environmental covariates. And looking over here at the right, I think this is a fun visualization. It definitely oversimplifies a lot of the work that's been done, but it really shows like the consistency that's happened between the Bat Hub and all the partners over the last couple of years. And I definitely want to congratulate everybody that's been a part of that effort because although we just have a bunch of little points on a map, I mean, this really represents thousands of hours of detector placement, followed by hundreds of hours of vetting every single year. So well done to everybody that has contributed to that. And it allows us to do kind of cool modeling exercises like this one. So since there are 15 species or 14, I can't remember if it's 14 or 15 in the Pacific Northwest, we broke them into rough groups based on their summer hibernating strategies. Don't want to get too hung up on it, but basically it was just too much to look at 15 maps at the same time. So these are generalists. You can see kind of across the Pacific Northwest, you can see that they don't have too much preference, with our Cilia labrum over here kind of being the outliers, only really occurring east of the Cascades there. Next, we have our cliff and canyon specialists. So the pallid bat, spotted bat, and parastrellus, where you can see, especially in spotted bat and parastrellus, we're getting kind of clustering maybe around certain features, a little less so with the pallid bat, but maybe still so. Next, we have our tree obligates. So being Llano and the hoary bat over here, kind of similar to our generalists, maybe even less trends across the landscape, just because of, I guess, the availability of trees. And then we put our Townsend's big-eared bat by itself because it kind of has its own thing going on that's definitely different from the other species. All right, so getting into the results of our model, these are the maps for generalists. I will say that I have all of these maps like more zoomed in as like an appendix. So if we do like breakout rooms after this or something, you guys can come and like scrutinize them a little bit more closely. But I do think for a lot of these, we're seeing a general trend where we have a little bit higher occurrence probabilities across the west side here, and then maybe in these kind of more temperate regions. And then we're getting lower across the more arid Eastern Cascades area and through this, I guess, I don't know what you'd call it exactly, but like Idaho arid region. I guess the exception to that is Cilia labrum. You can see that it seems to be preferring more arid areas. So I don't think that necessarily would remove it from this group or that it really matters, but still just wanted to point out, like, I guess the different trend there. So for our model, although we won't be looking at any like p-values or confidence intervals or anything like that, we can look at the top predictors that the model is using to make these predictions and just kind of spot check ourselves and make sure that it makes sense. So for example, for EPFU here, we have wetland, water, and forest cover, and you can see that pattern kind of repeated throughout, mostly using wetland and water features, forest cover a little bit to make those predictions. And not to say that these are the only features that it's using, but these are just the ones that had the largest weights. Next, we have our cliff and canyon specialists here. So we have our pallid bat, spotted bat, and parastrellus again. You can see that the model is really locking on to these canyon features. Like I think this is Hell's Canyon area for both parastrellus and our pallid bat. And I think that the spotted bat is maybe a little bit of an outlier here because of reasons that Sarah will talk about in a little bit. But you can see that it's kind of washed out, I guess you could say, across the landscape with these kind of cooler colors in the green teal range. And that's compared to these other models, that's kind of the model saying, it's a little closer to a coin flip, deciding if it's occurring in one of these areas. So just a little more maybe uncertainty there, you could say. Looking again, we see that it's mostly using cliff and canyon features, water features, wetland features to make these decisions, which I think makes sense based on what we know about the natural history of these species. Finally, have our tree obligates. These maps look pretty similar to the generalists. You can see that it's maybe locking onto water features a little bit more kind of throughout here, but you still see generally lower probability of occurrence in these more arid regions. And again, looking at those predictors, those ones are a little bit more strange. So like this hinge here is kind of one of those more complex features that I was talking about. But again, using a lot of wetland and water to make those decisions. Finally, we have the Townsend's big-eared bat, again with kind of its own trend that looks pretty different from everything else we've seen. Definitely preferring more arid regions, but not getting that like locking on to those kind of canyon features that we know about. So just kind of interesting there. Definitely prefer like seeing a lot of water features here. And again, looking at those top predictors. So I wanted to maybe walk through a quick thought experiment of what we could do with these maps, because if we pick them apart pixel by pixel, you're just going to find that not a lot of errors, but it's just not in how they're intended to work. They're intended to work on a like larger area level. And so I guess an idea for that would be, say, we could take each of our maps. We could say we want to overlay some region over it. In this case, that happens to be the Upper Deschutes Wildlife Management Unit for ODFW. And we could say maybe we want to take the median probability of occurrence across that area. And then we could do that for all of our species. And you can see all our little cutouts here. And it would give us a table that looks something like this. And we could say, if it's over some threshold, I just put 0.5 here because it's the most obvious and the most common to use. Then we could say that species occurs. And this could just be a tool. I know most of you already know a lot about what bats occur in your areas, but maybe there are some that you might not think about very commonly, but maybe they're like borderline or something like that. And that pretty much wraps up what I have for this. Did want to touch briefly on future directions. As Beth mentioned, there was a code vignette released recently for single seasons, single species occupancy modeling. It's already been done for the silver-haired bat, but we're going to try to kind of operationalize that for the rest of our species here. And I guess you could really consider this whole MaxEnt exercise as a warm up for that exercise. It's kind of helps because we've pulled a lot of the data together and things like that. And now we can kind of move into this next phase. Um, but yeah, I would definitely be happy to hear more about, what people's thoughts are about, how we can use this product or how you would like it to be used. And I left a slide for questions, but I'll leave that up to you, Beth, whether we're gonna do questions now or kind of do breakout rooms in a little while.
Yeah, I guess we have a couple minutes. So if folks have questions right now, for Trent, then yeah, we have a couple minutes. And if not, then we'll maybe get Sarah geared up. Oh, it does look like Rita had a comment on silver-haired bat. Low probability of occurrence in central part of Idaho is an artifact of coverage because most of that area is roadless and we don't have good coverage.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
And so Trent, I'm not sure how that was handled in your modeling, but I can just tell you if you throw a rock anywhere in Idaho, you're probably going to find a silver-haired bat. They occur statewide, and I think the more we learn about that species, it's at least here in Idaho where we are, I would not characterize that species as a tree obligate. That species, at least here, is one of the least specific species in terms of roost preferences. They just roost wherever they land.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks. Yeah, I didn't, I guess, account for that specifically in the model. I do think that if I don't have the map pulled up right here, but perhaps if you took like the average value, the average predicted value across Idaho, you would find that it's validating what you're saying that, it would say, yes, you probably do have this species in most places in Idaho.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and Aaron Adams, who's with Fish and Wildlife Service, says, I missed the time frame, the data you used for this model. Was it data just from the summer sampling efforts, or is this from acoustic records from each species annually?
Right. It is just from the summer monitoring efforts. Yeah. Sorry. I think I might not have said that. So thanks for clarifying.
Awesome. Any other questions for Trent before we move on to Sarah's Audible Bats project updates? All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Trent.
Yeah,
Really
no problem.
appreciate the work you've been doing with us. And yeah, I guess so Sarah's going to talk next about Audible Bats and give us an update there.
All right. Thank you.
Alrighty, let's go in. Oh, hey. Right. Great. Okay, so for some of you, this might be a little redundant if you came to this meeting last year, but I know we've got a lot of new faces here today, so I'm gonna do a little bit of project background, and then I'm gonna get into some very preliminary results. So first, just to familiarize folks, this project focuses, as Beth mentioned, on spotted bats and pallid bats. For spotted bats, we'll be thinking about improving predicted occupancy and range maps. And then for pallid bats, the focus is going to be on identifying maternity colony locations. So a little background on spotted bats. So some of you are probably familiar. These were historically thought to be not very common in Oregon or the Pacific Northwest in general. There's a few contributing factors for that. One of them is the frequency at which spotted bats echolocate. They're much lower than most of our bats, around 10 kilohertz. And so, if you think about kind of how we do NABAT, summer passive acoustic monitoring, we're trying to write these protocols and these implementation plans so that we are recording as many species as possible at a given location. So if you have a bat that's behaving differently than the majority of the bats in your region, you're less likely to pick it up, right? So we set up our detectors to try to record these common frequencies with bats, which are mostly above 20 kilohertz, and then spotted bats are hanging out down around 10 kilohertz. So we think they might have decreased detectability because of that. They also fly pretty high, which anyone who's tried to catch them knows that can be a particularly big challenge. So they're quite possibly flying outside of the range of our microphones. They also, at least I've found, that they really love to commute along the edges of incredibly steep cliffs and canyons. So again, that's a difficult place to put a detector. And if it's 50 feet above the edge of a cliff and then also 20 feet away from the edge of that cliff, they're pretty far away, so it can be hard to detect them. One of my hypotheses is also that we're encountering some surveyor bias here. So a lot of our folks that are setting up bat detectors in the arid regions of the Pacific Northwest that spotted bats are thought to occupy are probably really focused on desert water sources. I have found that you're much more likely to hear spotted bats with your ears at cliff and canyon features, especially at the top of those features as opposed to the bottom. And while I haven't really dug in and done an analysis on this yet, I do think that most of our detector locations in these arid regions are skewing heavily towards water sources and maybe the edges of forests or ag fields. So I think there's a few compounding factors here that leads us to have a high instance of false negative detection for spotted bats. Additionally, they are a species of concern for a number of agencies and in a number of states. So they're kind of a high priority for getting some more information about. And then we have our pallid bats. So the kind of simplest reason why we're focusing on pallid bats as well as spotteds is because it would be really silly to sit out and not listen for all of your audible species. So pallid bats and spotted bats occupy a lot of the same habitats. Their ranges overlap quite a bit, which you'll see in a moment. They both have preferences for cliff roosting. Pallid bats aren't quite cliff obligates the way that we think that spotted bats are, but they still do show a strong preference for roosting in cliffs. And they're very different from spotted bats in the vocalizations that they're producing that we can hear. So spotted bats are echolocating at that low frequency. Pallid bats echolocate at a higher frequency, so they're actually easier to record using traditional passive acoustic monitoring. But at their maternity colonies, they produce a lot of social calls that are at that lower frequency, similar to the spotted bat echolocation calls. And so they are audible to healthy human ears. Not everyone can hear them, but most people can. And they're very distinct. Those social calls are really distinct from those spotted bat echolocation calls. So they're very easy to tell apart once you hear them. So we figured that while we were listening for spotted bats, we might as well be listening for pallid bats. And we're going to try to use this information to hone in on pallid bat maternity colonies. So pallid bats are an interesting species. They seem to have a lot of variability in their life history strategies based on where they are. So there's a number of subspecies of pallid bats. Generally speaking, they're considered an arid lands species, but they also, occur historically in the Willamette Valley and in some wetter places. And then, they're thought to, or they do focus mostly in most of their range on preying on large terrestrial invertebrates like spiders, scorpions, etc. But then down in the Chiricahua Desert, they eat nectar from night blooming cacti. So they're a very adaptable species, and a lot of the research that has been done on them has been done in the desert Southwest. So I feel that we need more Pacific Northwest specific information about them. And then this is also just a good opportunity to kind of test and see if there's some sort of relationship between how often we're hearing these social calls and our proximity to maternity colonies. We know they chat a lot with each other at the maternity colonies. So is there a way to kind of use those to hone in on those locations? And then just real quick, here's our range map for these species in the Pacific Northwest. So the pallid bat is that kind of lavender color, spotted bat's that light yellow orange, and then the darker orange color is everywhere that they overlap. So that's the vast majority of each species range. So again, it just makes sense if you're going to listen to one, you might as well listen for the other. So how did this all come about? Well, all roads lead back to Tom Rodhouse, don't they? So back in the early 2000s, Tom and some colleagues were mist netting in the John Day Basin, and they were hearing spotted bats flying around, but they weren't really catching very many of them. I believe he tells a tragic story of having a spotted bat bounce into and then right back out of his net. And so they started toying with the idea of these listening surveys to detect spotted bats, and they recommended that in a paper that they published around that same time. Fast forward to 2019, and the Bat Hub had its first attempt at using listening surveys to increase our understanding of spotted bat occupancy. So this was the Central Oregon Spotted Bat Project. It was limited just to a little tri-county region in Central Oregon, focusing on the cliffs and canyon features that we're famous for here. And we got just a couple of volunteers. This was intended to be a citizen science project. And during some of those initial surveys, Tom heard a pallid bat, and that's what sparked the idea to add them to the project. So in 2020, I took over. We added pallid bats officially to the monitoring protocol. I had really big hopes and expectations, and then, COVID happened. So recruiting volunteers was incredibly difficult. Training them had to be done completely online. And so we didn't have quite the big push that we were hoping for in 2020, but we did get 12 volunteers. Admittedly, 6 of them worked at the HERS lab. But we got some surveys. We felt like we got a pretty decent proof of concept. We did take 2021 off because, again, COVID was still going on. It was still difficult to recruit and train volunteers. But then we picked the project back up in 2022, decided, we're going to try to cover all of Oregon. It continued to be a citizen science project. Got 16 volunteers that year, some of them super dedicated, which was great. We were increasing our coverage, but it still didn't feel like enough data to me. If I'm going to do something, I want to do it thoroughly. So this past year, 2023, we expanded to all of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. We had 28 volunteers, and I had 2 different volunteer survey types that year. So there were still these individual surveys where people could select from a number of locations, go out, they listen for an hour, they fill out a data sheet. But then I also did group surveys, because it turns out that asking people to drive out into the desert and sit there at the top of a cliff after dark is a really tall order. There was so much excitement. A lot of people wanted to get involved with bats, but then the actual like doing it spooked them a little bit. The general public is not super excited about being in the middle of nowhere after dark. So I organized events where I would offer to drive people from Bend to a high priority sample unit. We would set up tents, set up camp, and then do brief training. I would drive them out to various survey locations within that sample unit. We would all listen for an hour, and then I'd go collect everybody and bring them back to camp. And that seemed very successful. We had a number of repeat volunteers for those surveys. And it was a nice way for people to kind of dip a toe and get familiar with the protocol before they, some of them would go out and do surveys on their own afterwards. So that was great. That increased volunteership. We also had our summer bat technicians go out and do surveys, which was increased the amount of data we were collecting quite a bit. So each of our 2-person crews could do 2 to 4 surveys per night. And then we also asked all of you to participate in this project, and we did get some participation in each of the 3 states, which was great. And we're hoping to continue that. So again, just very preliminary results. What we're seeing here is just the 2023 results. So those gray boxes with the little slash marks are every sample unit where an Audible Bat survey was conducted this summer. The ones filled in with that kind of golden color are where spotted bats were heard and reported via the Audible Bats Project. And then everything outlined in that dark orange is where spotted bat presence was confirmed via passive acoustics this summer. So as you can see, and you'll see better in just a moment, there's actually not a ton of overlap. And just so you're all aware, any sample unit where our crews were doing Audible Bat surveys, they were doing those on the same night that we were doing the NA bat monitoring. So these were concurrent surveys, a lot of them, and we're still getting different results, which is pretty interesting. And a lot of times our crews were listening for these 2 species in the exact same locations that they had set up detectors. So just kind of, I think that's interesting. I think it serves as a good kind of proof that this is working, at least conceptually. And then just to kind of expand on that, now we have filled in every sample unit where spotted bats have been heard by surveyors since the project's inception. So that fills it in quite a bit more. So just kind of some interesting visuals there. This is just another way to look at it. So this is again just the 2023 results kind of split. That darker orange is for NA bat detections. The lighter kind of golden color again is our oral survey results. Again, we're seeing, not a lot of overlap. And then if we include all of the oral survey data, again, we're getting a lot of detections in sample units that we otherwise didn't think we had spotted bats in. For pallid bats, things look really different. As you can see, and we kind of talked about, we record them using passive acoustics in a lot more sample units than we do spotted bats, but we're still seeing some sample units where they are being heard but not recorded. So those will be filled in with lavender. It's a little harder to see on this, so I do apologize. But again, looking at it this way, we can see that there's some overlap, a little bit more than with spotted bats, but we're still getting additional occupancy information about these guys. So I do think this gives me hope for continuing to kind of flesh out this project and increase our rate of data acquisition. We do plan to continue having our staff conduct these listening surveys as a supplement to their passive acoustic deployments. I will be hosting 4 more group survey events this summer and reaching out to volunteers about individual surveys. Volunteers are going to be able to choose from a variety of sites across 3 states. I'm still working on those maps right now. This year, I'm also adding an incidental encounter form. So last year I had, the HERS Lab has a lot of folks working in a lot of different places. And I think 2 or 3 times I had coworkers come up to me after a trip and they'd be like, oh my gosh, I heard a spotted bat, but it wasn't a survey. So this is going to be kind of a really low effort way to get people involved in the project. Essentially, I'm going to put together a very short online training where you're just taught, what these bats sound like, how to identify them, and then there'll be a really short data sheet. So if you happen to be out and you hear one of these species, you can just report it super quick, hopefully like 30 seconds or less. And so I'm hoping that will increase the number of reports we have of these 2 species. And then we're going to be continuing to ask agency partners, such as you all, to participate. It's especially easy if you just do it in the same sample unit on the same night where you're doing your NA bat deployments. You just camp out for the evening or drive back afterwards. A lot of these survey sites are extremely scenic because we are focusing on those cliff and canyon features. So you hike out before sunset, you watch the sunset, and then you listen to bats for an hour. It really is a nice way to spend the night. So if anyone wants to get involved, please reach out to me. And then moving into the future, as Beth mentioned, I am a grad student. This is my thesis research, and it's going to be stretched out. I'm working full time while I go to school, so I have plenty of time to kind of toy with things, but I'll hopefully be starting some model development soon. One for spotted bat occupancy, and then one for pallid bat maternity colony location predictions. Yeah, so, I've just talked about it already, but these are kind of the 3 things that I'm hoping to focus on at this point. I also want to plan to test detection probabilities using a variety of methods, including oral surveys by volunteers, by professionals, and then passive acoustics using different kinds of detectors. So doing a little kind of comparative analysis there. The pallid bat maternity colony locations are going to be kind of my wild card conceptually. But if anyone has specific questions regarding either of these species, please let me know. At this point, things are still fairly flexible, and a big priority for me is making sure that my research is actually useful to those who are managing these species and their habitats. So I'm really open to inputs, different strategies. If there's a different kind of model you'd be interested in, please feel free to reach out to me. Like I said, this is going to be kind of a slow process for me as I go to school. So I've got lots of time to amend things. And I'm going to pitch again. We are looking for increased participation. Training is going to be offered online along with our NA bat training that Beth mentioned. Folks are also more than welcome to join for my group outings. Those dates, dates and location should be figured out fairly soon. If I can, I'm going to try to do outings in each of the 3 states. I haven't quite figured out the logistics of that just yet. But there's also, even if maybe your boss doesn't sign off on you getting paid to do these surveys, you're always more than welcome to do them as a citizen scientist. That's still a great way to get involved. So with that, I will stop yammering at you, and we have some time for questions. The website, like Beth mentioned, is under construction, but there will be lots of dates and information coming up there hopefully pretty soon. And yeah, feel free to reach out to me. But yeah, I think we have time for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. That was a great update.
Mhm.
We do have a couple of questions. Let's see here. Oh, Dylan asked, curious if anyone documents detections on iNaturalist.
Yeah, so
yeah.
there is a spotted bat project page on iNaturalist. There's been very little added to it. I have pulled some data from that. But yeah, not a ton. And I think that's mostly because the public at large doesn't know what they're hearing when they hear a spotted bat. Yeah, but it's one of the tools that we're still using, if not like actively pushing for.
And then Rita, you have your hand up.
Rita.
Hi, Sarah. That's great. And it's really exciting to see all the work that you've done and the engagement you've gotten from people. Just a couple of comments. One on pallet bats.
Mhm.
They will also use buildings for
Mhm.
maternity colonies. So, one possibility is public reporting and wildlife control operators potentially. And then another thing on spotted bats is they are also known to forage in ponderosa pine, low elevation, open ponderosa pine and clearings and things like that. So that might be something to consider in terms of where you survey.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I did forget to kind of get into that, but yeah, they're crazy commuters, you know. Um, and so while they do roost in those cliffs, they'll go just about anywhere to get a snack. So it, yeah. But thank you.
And then from Joel here in the chat, any general guidance for cliff and canyon features to consider for surveys?
Yeah, so we've found that like secondary canyons, so the canyons created by tributaries, have a higher level of success for detecting spotted bats than like the main river canyons themselves. They seem to like the narrower, smaller canyons. Um, I do suggest the taller and rockier the cliff or canyon seems to be the better. They really like those hyper dramatic landscapes as far as I've been able to tell. And what I found that's kind of interesting is if you're going to do a cliff top survey, which is what I generally recommend if you're going to go to a cliff, being at the top of it is much better. Trying to make sure that you are getting there right at sunset in case they come out a little earlier. Super anecdotal, but when I was doing a lot of these surveys, I noticed that I was hearing spotted bats right at sunset or just before sunset at the cliffs, and then if I was at like a water body or if I was lower in the canyon or at the bottom of a cliff, I was hearing them much later during the survey. So just kind of something interesting to keep in mind. But yeah, basically the more dramatic the cliff face, the more likely you are to hear spotted bats. Um, Let's see. I see a question from Dylan. Yes. Anyone who wants to get on the email list for events and volunteers, yeah, we'll go ahead and add you, Dylan. I've got your email address, but if anyone else wants to add theirs to the chat, please feel free. I will hopefully have updates very soon. And yeah, if you want to like adopt a sample unit, all the NABAT sample units that are within the range, which is most in the region of either of these species, are up for grabs. So if you want to survey some of those sample units, let me know. That would be great. Outside of Oregon, we don't have a volunteer base yet, so most of them, yeah, are up for grabs and unclaimed at this point. besides the ones that our teams will be doing. But oh, great. So many emails. Thanks, guys.
I know. Yeah, we're compiling a good list. Yeah, folks, just keep adding your emails in there if you want to be part of that list. So we'll compile those afterwards.
Excellent.
The Modus installation. Well, Nadia kind of oversees the Modus project. Right now, we just have the tower, which is having some issues with its detectability. So we have plans to move that tower. But yes, certainly you can reach out to me and I'll connect you with Nadia, and we can talk about Modus and whatever you have going on, Dylan. So I was going to have us do some breakout rooms so that if people had more directed questions for Trent or for Sarah, but based on my breakout room disaster from the beginning of this meeting, folks can just kind of linger. If you have some more questions for either Trent or Sarah or myself, feel free to hang on. But otherwise, this concludes our meeting. Really appreciate you all joining. It's great to have such a good turnout this year, and I'm really glad we kind of opened it up to more people. So yeah, you're also always welcome to reach out to me via email or phone call if you have more questions or you want to follow up on something. And otherwise, I'll be communicating with a number of you throughout the coming months. And just be on the lookout. I'll be sending out an email to this same whole list about when our annual training will be happening, which will include the updated protocol and some of those other things. So thanks so much for attending, everyone. And thanks to Trent and Sarah for presenting. Really appreciate the content that you guys shared and what you've been working on.
Thank you.
Thanks, Greta.
You all.
Bye.
Great to hear from you all. Look forward to working with you.
Thanks. Nice
Happy batting.
presentations.
Likewise. Thanks, Dylan. Looks like we have a few folks on here. Well, it's going to debrief, but maybe what I'll do is, oh, Sarah, can you stop the recording?
Oh, yes.
And grab that link, and then Trent, Nadia, hold on one second. Let me